In the ancient Roman world, power and control were not maintained solely through political maneuvering or military conquest. They were also reinforced through terror, humiliation, and spectacle. One of the most infamous tools of public intimidation was crucifixion, a method of execution that combined extreme physical suffering with psychological warfare. Unlike private executions, crucifixion was designed to be seen by as many people as possible, turning death into a public theater of fear that reinforced Roman authority while humiliating the condemned. Crucifixion was not just a form of punishment, it was a statement. It told anyone watching that defiance against Roman law or the state's authority would be met with an excruciatingly slow, degrading, and public death. Victims were often slaves, rebellious soldiers, criminals, or political enemies, but the selection could also include anyone Rome wished to make an example of. The practice was particularly prevalent during periods of unrest, such as during slave revolts, uprisings in conquered territories, or even moments of political tension within the empire. The process itself was designed to maximize suffering. Victims were typically scourged before being nailed or tied to a wooden cross. Scourging was a brutal ordeal. A Roman flagellum, a whip embedded with pieces of metal or bone, would tear into the flesh, leaving deep lacerations that weakened the victim and caused intense blood loss. This preparatory punishment was not merely a step before execution, it was a spectacle in its own right. Crowds would gather to witness the whipping, sometimes participating in the derision, shouting insults or throwing objects to heighten the victim's humiliation. By the time a condemned person was nailed to the cross, they were often on the brink of shock, suffering from both physical trauma and psychological terror. The placement of the crucifixion was carefully chosen. Crosses were often erected along roadsides, city walls, or near marketplaces where traffic and visibility were high. In this way, crucifixion served as a constant reminder of Rome's omnipotence. Passers-by would encounter the victim over hours or days, unable to ignore the suffering. The spectacle was extended deliberately. Roman authorities did not rush the process. Death by crucifixion could take hours, sometimes even days, depending on the method and the endurance of the individual. Respiratory failure, exposure, and the slow loss of blood combined to create a drawn-out agony that was horrifying to witness, reinforcing the power of the state through fear. One of the most infamous examples of crucifixion as a public humiliation occurred during the aftermath of the Third Servile War, 73 to 71 BCE, led by the legendary gladiator and rebel Spartacus. After crushing the slave rebellion, Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus sought to make a terrifying example of the captured slaves. According to historical accounts, thousands of captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road leading to Rome. The crucified men stretched for miles, their bodies exposed to the elements and to the gaze of any traveler along the route. This mass crucifixion was a deliberate act of psychological warfare. It sent a clear message to both the enslaved population and Roman citizens that rebellion would be met with merciless, prolonged suffering. Crucifixion also carried profound social and cultural implications. In Roman society, honor and dignity were highly valued, and being subjected to a public execution stripped a person of both. To be nailed to a cross in front of spectators was to be rendered powerless, helpless, and utterly humiliated. The victim was denied a proper burial in many cases, further erasing their social identity and leaving them to be scavenged by birds and animals. This extended humiliation beyond death, reinforcing the moral lesson that resistance to Rome was not only physically fatal but socially degrading. Moreover, crucifixion was often accompanied by symbolic punishments that intensified the degradation. Victims might be forced to carry the crossbeam to the execution site, a journey that was both exhausting and humiliating. Sometimes signs were affixed to the top of the cross, detailing the person's crime or the reason for their punishment. These inscriptions served as an additional layer of public shaming, announcing the individual's failings to the world. By intertwining physical torture with public humiliation and social disgrace, Crucifixion became a uniquely effective tool for maintaining Roman authority. The psychological impact extended to spectators as well, for the Roman elite, witnessing the suffering of criminals and enemies reinforced their sense of power and entitlement, while ordinary citizens were reminded of the consequences of defiance. Scholars have noted that the Romans understood the interplay between fear and obedience. The spectacle of crucifixion was a calculated method of control, aimed at deterring crime, rebellion, and dissent by making the cost of resistance visible and memorable. Religious and moral dimensions also played a role. Some historians argue that the slow, agonizing nature of crucifixion had quasi-ritualistic significance, turning the execution into a kind of societal purification by punishing those who had violated Roman law. Victims were often chosen for their social status, criminal acts, or perceived threat, making the crucifixion a public lesson in morality and obedience. For conquered peoples, this display reinforced Roman cultural superiority, presenting Rome not only as a military power, but as a morally sanctioned authority capable of inflicting divine-like punishment on those who opposed it. It is impossible to discuss crucifixion without mentioning its most famous victim, Jesus of Nazareth. While his execution occurred within a complex religious and political context, it exemplifies many of the same principles of Roman public humiliation. Jesus was scourged, mocked, forced to carry his cross, and ultimately executed in a highly visible location outside Jerusalem. The spectacle was intended to assert Roman authority, discourage rebellion, and publicly shame someone who had attracted followers that might challenge the social order. The enduring historical and religious significance of this crucifixion demonstrates how such public executions were deeply ingrained in Roman culture, both as a method of punishment and as a means of social control. In conclusion, crucifixion in ancient Rome was far more than a method of execution. It was a meticulously designed public humiliation, a form of social theater that combined extreme physical pain, psychological torment, and societal degradation. It served as a warning to the masses, a demonstration of the state's power, and a means of maintaining social order through fear. By turning death into a spectacle, the Romans ensured that the consequences of defiance were visible, memorable, and utterly terrifying. For the victims, crucifixion was the ultimate loss of dignity. For the spectators, it was a chilling reminder of the empire's merciless reach. The legacy of this brutal practice continues to fascinate and horrify, offering a stark window into the ways ancient societies wielded power through fear and public humiliation. Among the many cruel spectacles of ancient Rome, few were as horrifying and psychologically devastating as Damnatio Ad Bestias, or condemnation to the beasts. This form of execution involved throwing condemned criminals, prisoners of war, rebels, and sometimes even Christians into the arena to face wild animals, often with little to no chance of survival. Unlike a swift execution, Damnatio Ad Bestias was designed to combine terror, public humiliation, and raw entertainment into a single gruesome spectacle, reinforcing the absolute authority of the Roman state while demonstrating the fragility of human life when weighed against the empire's might. The origin of this practice is complex, but it became particularly prominent during the late Republic and imperial periods. The Roman appetite for blood sports grew from a combination of political, social, and religious motivations. In addition to punishing wrongdoers, the spectacles of the arena were intended to entertain the masses, demonstrate the power of the emperor or ruling elite, and reinforce societal hierarchies. The arena was a stage where the ultimate humiliation could be inflicted upon a condemned person, stripping them of dignity, instilling fear in the populace, and turning death into a public performance. The condemned were often paraded before the crowd, sometimes wearing minimal clothing or symbolic garments, marking them as criminals. They were mocked and ridiculed by spectators who shouted insults and jeers, intensifying the humiliation. In some cases, individuals were forced to perform humiliating gestures or wear devices that signified their crimes or moral failings. These pre-execution rituals were designed to maximize the psychological torment and to create an atmosphere of dread among the audience. Once the preliminaries were complete, the gates of the arena would open, and the condemned would face their terrifying fate. The wild beasts used in these executions were not ordinary animals. Lions, tigers, leopards, bears, and even elephants could be imported from across the empire to awe spectators with their exotic ferocity. Roman organizers carefully selected animals for their strength, aggression, and ability to instill terror. Lions were particularly favored for their symbolic status as kings of beasts and their ability to dismember human bodies with terrifying efficiency. Bears were used for their sheer strength, while exotic felines brought a sense of spectacle and novelty. Sometimes, multiple animals were released simultaneously, turning the arena into a chaotic scene of human suffering and primal violence. Accounts from historians like Seneca and Dio Cassius illustrate the harrowing nature of these events. In some cases, prisoners were tied to stakes and left defenseless as lions approached, while in others, the condemned were armed with minimal weapons or none at all, forced to fend for themselves in a fight that was almost always unwinnable. The crowd's reaction was an integral part of the execution. Roman citizens and visitors to the arena were encouraged to cheer, jeer, and participate in the spectacle, creating a collective experience of both fear and excitement. For the condemned, the humiliation extended beyond the threat of death. It was the complete loss of agency and dignity, displayed for all to see. The psychological torment inflicted by Damnatio Ad Bestias went beyond the immediate fear of death. Some executions involved elaborate setups that increased suffering, such as placing multiple prisoners in confined spaces with aggressive animals or forcing the condemned to witness the deaths of others before facing their own end. The anticipation, combined with the screams and chaos of the arena, created a horrifying environment in which human suffering became a form of entertainment. Executioners and arena organizers took care to prolong the spectacle, ensuring that the audience experienced a drawn-out display of terror and brutality. One of the most chilling aspects of these executions was their use as a political tool. Damnatio Ad Bestias was often employed against rebels, slaves, or political dissidents to send a message to the populace. The spectacle served as a warning. Defiance against Roman authority would result not only in death, but in an agonizing, humiliating, and public demise. For example, during the reign of Emperor Titus, thousands of captives from the Jewish revolt were thrown to the beasts in the Colosseum as a demonstration of Rome's dominance and as a means of deterring future uprisings. The spectacle was meticulously designed to instill fear, enforce obedience, and reinforce the empire's social and political hierarchies. Religious and cultural dimensions also played a significant role in Damnatio Ad Bestias. Some executions were staged during festivals or in conjunction with religious ceremonies, intertwining punishment with ritual. The arena became a place where moral, social, and divine authority intersected. The condemned were presented as morally corrupt or sacrilegious, and their suffering was framed as a societal and cosmic necessity. In this way, the execution was more than a legal punishment. It became a symbolic act reinforcing the moral and spiritual order as defined by Roman society. Interestingly, there were moments when the execution could be extended into a perverse form of sport. Some skilled gladiators or condemned individuals were given weapons or forced to fight against multiple beasts, creating a false sense of hope that survival were possible. These scenarios heightened tension, both for the individual and for spectators, turning death into a prolonged and interactive spectacle. The Romans understood the psychological impact of such experiences. By alternating between fear, hope, and terror, the audience became emotionally invested, and the humiliation of the condemned was intensified. For the condemned, the experience was often excruciatingly long. Death could take hours depending on the type of animal, the number of participants, and the physical condition of the individual. Some historians note that individuals who survived initial attacks were sometimes left to bleed out slowly or were repeatedly attacked, prolonging their suffering for the sake of spectacle. The combination of physical trauma, fear, and public ridicule made Damnatio Ad Bestias one of the most psychologically and physically devastating forms of execution in Roman history. The legacy of Damnatio Ad Bestias has endured in both historical memory and popular imagination. Accounts of Christians being thrown to lions in the Colosseum, for instance, have become iconic symbols of Roman cruelty, even though the historical accuracy of specific incidents is debated. Nevertheless, these stories highlight the extreme nature of public humiliation and spectacle in ancient Rome, revealing a society in which entertainment, punishment, and terror were deeply intertwined. In conclusion, Damnatio Ad Bestias was far more than a method of execution. It was a calculated, horrifying spectacle designed to humiliate, terrorize, and reinforce Roman authority. The condemned were not only deprived of life, but stripped of dignity, exposed to terrifying predators, and made the center of a public display that combined fear, spectacle, and political messaging. For spectators, the events provided a mixture of excitement, moral reinforcement, and psychological stimulation, while for the victims, they represented the ultimate loss of control, the cruelest form of public humiliation, and a slow, agonizing path to death. Through this practice, Rome demonstrated its mastery over both the physical and psychological realms, turning suffering into entertainment and obedience into a spectacle. While ancient Rome is often remembered for its grand architecture, military conquests, and cultural achievements, it was equally notorious for its political theater, where power struggles were frequently settled not just by legislation or warfare, but through public humiliation. For Roman politicians, senators, and social elites, honor and reputation were the currency of influence. Losing face in the public eye could be more devastating than physical harm or even legal punishment, and the state, and sometimes rival elites, used various methods to humiliate those who fell out of favor. Public shaming was a deliberate and highly strategic tool, blending psychology, social pressure, and politics into a spectacle that could destroy a person's career, reputation, and social standing. One of the most common forms of public humiliation for elites involved parading them through the streets in degrading situations. This could be the result of legal punishment, political defeat, or moral transgression. For example, disgraced politicians might be forced to wear sackcloth, chains, or other garments that signified shame. Their heads could be shaved, symbolizing a loss of dignity and authority. These visual markers were immediately recognizable to Roman citizens, sending a clear signal that the individual had committed some offense against the state, society, or the moral order. The parade itself was not only punitive but theatrical, designed to maximize exposure and reinforce social hierarchies. The political use of humiliation in Rome was particularly effective because the city's culture placed extraordinary emphasis on reputation. Roman elites lived in a society where public honor, known as dignitas, and social respect, or auctoritas, were central to power. Losing public favor could strip an individual of influence over the Senate, reduce their ability to command troops, or make them vulnerable to further attacks from rivals. Consequently, public shaming was not merely a punishment, but a strategic maneuver in the high-stakes world of Roman politics. A carefully orchestrated humiliation could permanently weaken a rival without a single sword being drawn. One illustrative example comes from the late Roman Republic, a period rife with political intrigue and violent rivalry. Figures like Cicero, the famous orator and statesman, often used public speeches to humiliate political opponents, exposing their corruption, incompetence, or moral failings before the Senate and the Roman populace. However, the consequences of political missteps could also work in reverse. Cicero himself suffered public disgrace when he opposed powerful figures like Mark Antony. After his exile, Cicero's statues and symbols of honor were publicly defaced, demonstrating that even intellectual and rhetorical skill could not protect one from the machinery of social and political humiliation. Another notorious tactic involved mock trials or exaggerated punishments, where the accused would be made to endure public scorn in a controlled setting. Senators or equestrians who violated moral codes or engaged in corruption could be subjected to public censure, nota censoria, a formal declaration of disgrace that often included parading the offender in the forum. Sometimes, the humiliation was ritualistic, designed to emphasize moral lessons for the citizenry. For example, a politician convicted of bribery or embezzlement might be forced to wear symbols of shame, while the magistrates or consuls recited their crimes aloud, ensuring that the public was acutely aware of the individual's wrongdoing. Physical displays of shame were also common. Public whipping, beatings, or exposure to ridicule could accompany political punishment, particularly for those who had committed offenses deemed morally corrupt or cowardly. In some cases, elites were forced to stand in the marketplace or forum, enduring insults and jeers from ordinary citizens who were encouraged to participate in the spectacle. The Roman crowd's involvement was critical. Humiliation was amplified when a person of high status was reduced to the level of common mockery. This inversion of social order, where the powerful were rendered powerless, was both a warning to others and a form of entertainment for the populace. Humiliation extended beyond the streets and the forum into the legal and social mechanisms of the state. Exile was a particularly insidious form of public shaming for elites. While technically a legal punishment, exile was often accompanied by public rituals or decrees that emphasized the individual's disgrace. Statues or portraits could be removed or defaced, family estates confiscated, and social privileges revoked. The loss of social visibility was psychologically devastating, as Roman elites relied heavily on public acknowledgement of their status and accomplishments. In this sense, exile was not merely physical removal. It was a form of socially engineered invisibility, a deliberate erasure of prestige. Interestingly, some punishments were symbolically theatrical rather than physically painful, underscoring the performative nature of Roman humiliation. For instance, a politician might be compelled to participate in a ritual that mimicked his wrongdoing, or wear garb that turned him into a literal embodiment of shame. These rituals combined symbol, ism, spectacle, and social pedagogy, ensuring that the audience not only witnessed the punishment, but understood its moral and political significance. The humiliation was as much about education, teaching citizens the consequences of unethical behavior, as it was about retribution. Humiliation was also used strategically in electoral politics. Roman elections were fiercely competitive, and accusations of corruption, cowardice, or moral weakness were often leveraged to publicly discredit rivals. Pamphlets, speeches, and public demonstrations could amplify minor errors or exaggerate personal failings, turning them into large-scale scandals. Candidates could be forced to appear before the crowd in ways that highlighted their incompetence or arrogance, undermining their credibility. The public nature of these tactics ensured that political opponents were not only defeated but shamed in a way that left a lasting impression on voters. The psychological effects of public humiliation on elites were profound. Roman society placed an extraordinary emphasis on honor, reputation, and social status. A public disgrace could destroy an individual's self-identity, isolate them socially, and compromise their career permanently. In some cases, humiliated elites chose suicide over continued shame, viewing death as a way to reclaim some measure of dignity. Philosophers such as Seneca reflected on these pressures, noting that the fear of public ridicule could be more terrifying than physical danger because social standing was intimately tied to survival in the political arena. Public shaming also reinforced the power of the masses in a society that was otherwise hierarchical. By witnessing the humiliation of elites, ordinary citizens were reminded that even the most powerful individuals were subject to the law, social norms, and the moral expectations of the community. Humiliations serve. D. As a social equalizer in this sense, demonstrating that the emperor, senator, or wealthy magistrate was not immune to scrutiny, judgment, or ridicule. It was a form of social control that relied on psychological pressure as much as legal authority. In conclusion, the public shaming of politicians and social elites in ancient Rome was a complex, calculated tool of power. It combined ritual, spectacle, and social judgment to humiliate individuals, destroy reputations, and reinforce hierarchies. For the victims, the consequences were devastating: loss of dignity, social isolation, and often psychological torment. For the state and the populace, these public humiliations were both a warning and a form of entertainment, illustrating the intricate ways in which ancient Romans blended politics, morality, and performance. By turning shame into a public spectacle, Rome ensured that the social order was maintained not only through laws and military might, but through the indelible power of humiliation. Ancient Rome was a society deeply intertwined with religion and ritual, where divine favor was believed to underpin political stability and social order. Religious officials, priests, and particularly the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, held positions of immense prestige and influence. Their duty was to maintain the sacred fire of Vesta, a symbol of Rome's eternal life, and to perform complex religious rites that protected the city and its people. However, with such high status came strict moral and behavioral expectations. Violations, whether real or perceived, were met not merely with punishment but with public humiliation, reinforcing the notion that no one, not even those closest to the divine, was above the law or social scrutiny. The Vestal Virgins were bound by a vow of chastity lasting 30 years, and their moral conduct was considered a reflection of Rome's own virtue. A Vestal accused of sexual misconduct, known as incestum, faced a punishment that was both physically brutal and psychologically humiliating. Unlike typical criminal penalties, the punishment for a Vestal was highly ritualized, emphasizing both their sacred duty and their disgrace. Because it was forbidden to shed the blood of a Vestal, the method of execution was particularly cruel. She would be buried alive in an underground chamber with minimal provisions. The act itself was a chilling mixture of religious ritual and societal shaming, sending a clear message about the sanctity of their role and the consequences of moral failure. The humiliation associated with this punishment extended beyond the condemned Vestal herself. The priestess would often be paraded or led through public spaces before her burial, making her the focus of collective scrutiny and revulsion. Crowds could witness her disgrace, reinforcing societal norms and the power of religious authority. In some cases, political rivals or ambitious citizens could exploit accusations against Vestals as a way to undermine the authority of influential families, turning religious punishment into a weapon of social and political manipulation. The public nature of these rituals ensured that the humiliation was as symbolic as it was punitive, linking the spiritual failure of an individual to the broader moral and civic health of Rome. The consequences of religious failures were not confined to the Vestals. Priests, augurs, and other religious officials could also be publicly shamed for misconduct or mistakes in ritual practice. Omens and signs were taken extremely seriously. A misinterpreted reading or improperly conducted ceremony could be construed as an offense against the gods, threatening the safety and prosperity of the state. Such failures could result in fines, public censure, or ritualized humiliation, designed to restore balance and assert accountability. In this sense, Rome's system of religious punishment was deeply intertwined with its social and political structures. Humiliation was not merely about individual retribution. It reinforced collective responsibility and the community's faith in divine protection. In addition to ritualized punishments, the Romans employed symbolic acts of degradation to reinforce public shame. Vestals accused of misconduct might have their hair cut short, a gesture signaling loss of purity and spiritual authority. This symbolic gesture communicated to the public that the individual's sacred status had been stripped, leaving them vulnerable to ridicule and social ostracism. In other cases, images or effigies of the offender were displayed in public spaces, a visual reinforcement of moral failure. The meticulous attention to public perception highlights the psychological dimension of Roman religious punishment. Shame and fear were tools as powerful as physical coercion. The intertwining of religion and public humiliation also extended to the wider citizenry through festivals and rituals. During certain public ceremonies, officials and ordinary citizens alike could be called out for lapses in moral or religious duties. Fines, temporary humiliation, or public admonition served as a stark reminder that societal well-being depended on adherence to both legal and spiritual codes. The spectacle of punishment, whether against Vestals or ordinary Romans, reinforced collective values and highlighted the consequences of transgression. The use of ritualized humiliation transformed personal failure into a public lesson, ensuring that morality and obedience were visually and emotionally reinforced. The psychological impact on those punished was profound. For Vestal Virgins, the consequences were existential. The violation of a sacred oath could result in death, social ostracism, and eternal infamy. Even those who survived accusations or lesser sanctions faced enduring stigma. Historical accounts describe former Vestals living under the shadow of their disgrace, unable to reclaim the prestige or trust they had once held. The ritualization of their punishment made the humiliation inescapable. It was codified in law, performed in public, and imbued with religious symbolism, leaving victims little room for personal redemption. Religious humiliation in Rome also served as a tool of political leverage. Ambitious politicians could manipulate accusations of moral or religious misconduct to discredit rivals or consolidate power. For instance, the accusation of a Vestal's misconduct could tarnish the reputation of the family that sponsored her, weaken political alliances, or cast doubt on the judgment of magistrates responsible for supervising religious rites. In a society where religious observance, political authority, and social hierarchy were tightly interwoven, public humiliation became a strategic instrument, demonstrating that no individual, regardless of divine favor or social status, was immune to scrutiny. Perhaps one of the most famous cases illustrating the intersection of religion, politics, and public humiliation is the story of Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia, the mother of Rome's legendary founders, Romulus and Remus. Although her story is partly mythological, it reflects the Roman understanding of the stakes involved in religious transgression. Accusations of sexual misconduct against a Vestal were treated with the utmost seriousness because they symbolized not only the moral failings of an individual, but also potential threats to the city's destiny. The extreme punishments and public rituals associated with such offenses underscore the cultural weight placed on purity, obedi, NCE, and the societal consequences of personal failure. Even beyond the Vestals, religious punishment in Rome often involved ritualized humiliation as a mechanism of social control. Individuals accused of desecrating temples, neglecting sacred rites, or misinterpreting auguries were publicly admonished, sometimes forced to perform symbolic acts of atonement in the forum or other central spaces. These spectacles reinforced communal standards, ensuring that citizens internalized moral and spiritual norms. Public humiliation thus became a performative act, demonstrating both the consequences of transgression and the continuing authority of religious and civic institutions. In conclusion, the humiliation of Vestal Virgins and other religious figures in ancient Rome represents one of the most striking examples of how personal shame, ritualized punishment, and public spectacle were intertwined. For those punished, the consequences were devastating: loss of dignity, social ostracism, and often death. For the state and society, these events reinforced moral, religious, and social hierarchies, demonstrating that no individual, even one closest to the divine, was above the law. By combining ritual, public exposure, and symbolic acts of degradation, Rome transformed religious transgression into a lesson for the entire community. The enduring fascination with these punishments underscores the deep psychological and cultural impact of public humiliation in Roman society, revealing a civilization in which honor, purity, and obedience were enforced as dramatically as any military conquest. In ancient Rome, military conquest was not merely about gaining territory or resources. It was a performance of power, prestige, and dominance. Victorious generals celebrated their triumphs with grand processions through the city, showcasing spoils, captives, and symbols of conquest. But alongside these official celebrations existed a darker, more humiliating tradition, the mock triumphs and parades of the defeated. Unlike the glorified victories of Rome's leaders, these events were orchestrated spectacles of degradation designed to humiliate vanquished enemies, humiliate political rivals, and reinforce the social and political order. They transformed military and political defeat into public shame, leaving indelible marks on those forced to participate. The parades of the defeated were meticulously planned events, often held in conjunction with genuine Roman triumphs. Captured leaders, enemy soldiers, and sometimes entire populations were marched through the streets of Rome under armed guard, stripped of weapons, robes, or armor, and dressed in humiliating garments that highlighted their subjugation. The spectacle was highly visual. Defeated foes were often adorned with chains, forced to kneel, or made to carry symbols of their surrender. The aim was clear: demonstrate the absolute superiority of Rome and reduce the enemy's social and political stature to nothing more than a display of public ridicule. These parades were staged as lessons in power and obedience, both for the defeated and for the Roman populace. By displaying captives in the heart of the city, Roman authorities reminded citizens and foreigners alike of the empire's military might and political dominance. The defeated were deprived of dignity and agency. They became objects of spectacle, a visual representation of Rome's ability to conquer and control. The humiliation was amplified when the defeated were forced to participate in symbolic acts of subjugation, such as carrying trophies of their own armies or performing gestures of surrender. In this way, the parade served as a psychological extension of the battlefield, continuing the domination beyond physical conflict. One of the most notorious examples occurred following Rome's campaigns in Gaul under Julius Caesar. After crushing the Gallic resistance, Caesar paraded captured Gallic chieftains and soldiers through the city as a warning to any who might contemplate rebellion. These prisoners were dressed in garb that highlighted their foreignness and vulnerability, often subjected to verbal mockery by soldiers and citizens alike. The visual and psychological impact of such parades was immense. By turning conquered enemies into symbols of Rome's superiority, the parades reinforced the empire's image as an unstoppable power. The humiliation was not limited to external enemies. Rome's political culture also exploited public parades to target internal rivals and disgraced citizens. Senators, magistrates, or generals who fell out of favor could be forced to march through the city in a display of political defeat, sometimes carrying emblems of shame or performing acts that mocked their previous status. These parades served as a potent form of social control, signaling to the populace that even the powerful were not immune to public scorn. Political humiliation in this context was as much about spectacle and theater as it was about punishment, blurring the line between civic law, personal vendetta, and entertainment. Mock triumphs often incorporated elements of ritual and symbolism to magnify the degradation. Captives could be made to kneel before their conquerors, lift banners of surrender, or participate in staged reenactments of their own defeat. These orchestrations transformed the parade into a moral lesson, emphasizing the futility of resisting Roman authority. The rituals were carefully choreographed to ensure that the audience, both Roman citizens and visiting dignitaries, understood the political and moral message. Defiance was dangerous, submission was mandatory, and humiliation was inevitable for those who dared oppose Rome. The psychological dimension of these parades was profound. For the defeated, the experience was a total loss of agency. Soldiers who had fought bravely on the battlefield could suddenly find themselves stripped of weapons, stripped of armor, and mocked before thousands. Leaders were often forced to bow, kneel, or even carry their own standards of defeat, gestures that symbolized not only physical subjugation, but social and political annihilation. The mental toll was immense. The parade was a prolonged public display of powerlessness, intended to crush morale, instill fear, and solidify Rome's dominance in the minds of both the defeated and the spectators. The public humiliation also served a functional role for Roman society. By converting defeat into spectacle, authorities could channel societal tensions and emotions into controlled environments. Citizens were allowed to express triumph, anger, or mockery within the structured context of a parade, reducing the likelihood of spontaneous revolt or unrest. The defeated, meanwhile, were transformed into objects of moral instruction. Their suffering and shame served as a warning to others, reinforcing obedience to both military authority and civic norms. In essence, the mock triumph was a calculated exercise in psychological warfare performed in the heart of the empire. Historical accounts provide vivid glimpses into the scale and intensity of these humiliations. Polybius and Livy describe instances where defeated armies, sometimes numbering in the thousands, were marched through Rome under the watchful eyes of citizens, magistrates, and generals. The spectacle included not only captives, but also looted treasures, destroyed banners, and symbolic representations of the conquered territories. The triumph was as much about narrative control as military celebration. The parade allowed Rome to craft the story of conquest, glorifying its generals while vilifying or ridiculing the vanquished. In some cases, mock triumphs were deliberately exaggerated to maximize humiliation. Captives could be dressed in grotesque costumes, forced to perform absurd tasks, or made to enact staged reenactments of their own surrender. These embellishments blurred the line between reality and theater, turning punishment into entertainment. The audience became complicit in the psychological degradation of the defeated, experiencing both the thrill of victory and the satisfaction of witnessing justice, or what was portrayed as justice, done in public. Even in defeat, the conquered could be subjected to extended periods of humiliation. Some prisoners were forced to march for days, exposed to heat, exhaustion, and public derision before reaching the forum or the triumphal route. Their suffering was carefully calculated to ensure maximum visibility and impact. For leaders, the parade often marked the beginning of a long period of captivity or exile, further reinforcing the consequences of resistance and underscoring the inexorability of Roman power. In conclusion, mock triumphs and parades of the defeated represent one of the most striking examples of public humiliation in ancient Rome. Through ritual, symbolism, and carefully orchestrated spectacle, the Romans transformed military defeat into a performance of social and political power. The psychological and emotional impact on the defeated was devastating, stripped of dignity, exposed to ridicule, and forced to participate in their own degradation. For Roman society, these parades served as a tool of social control, moral instruction, and entertainment, reinforcing the empire's supremacy while reminding citizens and enemies alike that obedience, submission, and humility were compulsory under Roman rule. By combining theatrical spectacle with punishment, Rome demonstrated that victory was not only about conquest on the battlefield, but also about domination in the minds, hearts, and public perception of all who witnessed the empire's power.